Hi, it's Glenn with War for the West back at you today. We're going to discuss and define what socialism is in a brief video here because there's so much confusion out there, and let me explain why I want to define this. So, um, Socialism is kind of this boogeyman on the right for good reasons. But what I find is because our educational system is so screwed, right? I mean, they're just so dead set against tradition and conservatism, anything that's not left, right? That you have been actually not educated about socialism. Like they don't actually talk to you about what it means and what it is and what it isn't. And then what happens is you get in a debate with a Marxist or somebody who really knows anything about this stuff, and you start to sound really silly quickly. And by that, that's intentional. They want you to feel that way. So I'm going to give you a very simple explanation of all this so you'll never get confused again. I hope it's helpful. So, what is socialism, right? Socialism is not Marxism, by the way. Do you understand that? Socialism is not Marxism. Yeah? Be really clear about that. It's very important that you understand that we're talking about two different things. Socialism started out of the French Revolution as a term. The word didn't exist until the early 1800s. The French Revolution is around the turn of the 17th to the 18th, 1700s to the 1800s, the beginning of the 19th century. Always confusing for people. We talk about the 19th century, that's the 1800s, okay? So early 19th century French, a political philosopher named Fourier and some other guys came up with this idea of socialism. And what was it to mean, right? Socialism is a way of organizing government that asserts the collective good of the people, of the nation, of the people, which is expressed through the state, it has to be, as what needs to be optimized and managed most in society. This is as opposed to classical liberalism. Classical liberalism seeks to limit government and protect individual rights and leave a free society that isn't run with the power of the law by the elite, right? In other words, we have a free, open civic space that's very large that can exist in socialism. It takes so many different ideas, like just expression of arts, or the way, stores do, organize themselves in towns and things like this. My point is that a socialist will never leave decisions to the individual. And what they do is they reject, essentially, socialists looked at the classical liberal order that was being promoted by philosophers in the West. This is very important that you get this, what was going on in this time historically, okay? This idea of progress and individual rights and liberty, what grew up out of Christianity and got its expression in societies in France and Great Britain and elsewhere early. And there was a huge debate within those societies. So what happens is the socialism is grabbed by some as the next step of progress, right? What they see as classical liberalism, just protecting rights and trying to create limited government, didn't work. Also, remember, this comes out of a European context where there was a very strong aristocracy. They were still trying to rid themselves of monarchies, but the class structure of society was much stronger than it was in the States. So Marx is really, he's not correct, but he does see the class division and the materialistic problems of society in Europe very clearly. It doesn't occur the same in the United States. It's more like that now because what we've done is we've created a socialist style government where elites are empowered to run many things now, right? So that all changed under FDR, by the way. Before that, elites, like a federal government, is very small. It could do very little. The idea, like before 1900, that the government was responsible for the economy, people be like, okay, maybe to some degree, but like, people didn't really see government as this godhead delivering all the ambient conditions that we live in, and that they must be perfect or else government has failed. It's a totally different conception of what government should be. And that kind of thinking about government is what socialism is. Yes? It's that government is there to take care of any problem that comes up. And socialism means I can solve the problem as long as it's for the collective good. I can violate individual people's rights. I can lock them up. I can silence them. I can take their property if it's for the greater good. Classical liberalism, which is how our society is organized, is supposed to never allow government to do that, right? Government is not empowered to violate your rights. Government is limited in what it can do. That's liberty. So think of liberty as what we're focused on, and that socialism is really focused on equality. And a nice way to think about this is the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution which kind of closely followed each other and overlapped in real ways in terms of the thinkers and the people involved. Um, our revolution was to bring about liberty and to constrain government. The French Revolution was to bring about equality and empower the state to deliver equality, and that's why they cut so many people's heads off. Because eventually, what you figure out, you can't get people to do what you want them to do in a lot of cases, especially when it's more and more complex, and it doesn't seem really. It's not like the basics of just your sort of morality that you have like as a human being living like in a society like a in other words, it violates very basic aspects of natural law is a better way to say that. So socialism comes along and they have to justify that, but human beings have this sense that something's wrong there. So what happens is they just start killing people like mad, and it gets politically insane. Meanwhile, the U.S. is exploding because we've limited government, focused on liberty. You have to understand the socialists are focused on equality as an equality of outcomes, whereas classical liberalism focuses on protecting individual rights and limiting government, right? So, and this is not clearly explained to you. So then we throw Marx into the mix. What does Marx do? So let's go back and take a look at what Marx does here, right? Marx proposes something called scientific socialism, yeah? Do you understand? That term, does anybody know what that is out there? Let me explain it. So what Marx does, he says, by the way, there's a whole school of philosophical thought that's taken Europe by storm at this point, right? It's a guy named Hegel, and there's a whole branch of historical study called German historicism. There's kind of a battle between the French and the Germans for philosopher king, and who's actually got the best sort of views on the world. And the Germans are starting to win this intellectual battle in the 19th century for sure. I mean, the French kind of screwed up because they drove the nation into a ditch, and Napoleon had to come back. Like their whole experiment with egalitarianism didn't work out that well. The way the American experiment with liberalism worked out so well. So what happens is you got people trying to explain what's wrong, what went wrong with socialism, right? Well, what went wrong with socialism is that it sort of basically recreated a society run by the elite, right? And that didn't really change anything. So, Marx wants to build something called scientific socialism. And this is based not on a spiritual idea, philosophical idea, but on a materialistic analysis. He makes the claim that actually class structure and the way society is created and the way our government is created is by an elite for their benefit to control the masses and extract what they want from them. And so he says this is how it works. And the class struggle we see, the wheel of history that Hegel talked about, because by the way, all the progressives, all the people on the left kind of came together in the 19th century and decided that we are on this endless wheel of progress. You may have heard of a book called The End of History written by a guy named Fukuyama after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's a continuation of this thinking, because German historicism posited that there was this historical process that was going on, and people were rising up and pushing back, and this was inevitable, right? And then Marx wanted to make it scientific. In other words, he proposed all of these metaphysics that were axioms you could reason from, right? Not the heuristics, the rules of thumb that we use in classical liberalism, but this absolute scientific truth that you can reason from. This is why Marxists are so didactic, are so, sure of themselves, because they've got reasoning established for everything. And by the way, by now, you've literally had hundreds of thousands of scholars working on Marxism, advancing it, refining it. If I go I made the mistake of trying to read modern Marxists once and trying to get into what some of these more sophisticated thinkers are doing. And by the way, it's endless. All this critical theory stuff, you could study it for the rest of your life and not finish the books. And it's really part of the game, right? They make it all seem so complex that the experts have to figure this out. What they're figuring out is not that complex, right? But they talk to you in a way that makes you think it is. And they sucked in a whole generation of people who thought, aha, I can see the class unfairness. I can see the exploitation of the system. Marx must be right, right? But the truth is he's not, because what happened is Marx's model would never predict the U.S. could happen. Our middle class growing in the 20th century and in the 19th century as well basically gave rise to the lie of most European philosophers who thought that the poor were just going to be exploited and could never move up. We had a bit of a class society imposed on us by the Brits when this nation was started, right? We inherited that, but a lot of that was stripped away. And while we did have sort of an elite and aristocracy that emerged informally, we didn't have a formal aristocracy. And that's a huge difference, right? There's no lords, no titles, things like that. So class society in the U.S. was always a bit more of a meritocracy, believe it or not. And a lot of the people who made it big early on in the 19th century Americas, were self-made people, right? They weren't like rich British lords who came over and were just using their wealth to dominate. They actually invented things like, steam engines and various ways of extracting oil and all kinds of amazing tech and industrial capability and whatnot. So when you look at the comparisons that get made to, like, American class structure to European class structure, you cannot make the comparison because of the history of monarchy and the history of aristocracy in those societies, right? So what happens, they try to apply this model of this critique, which is very narrow, and they've already proved doesn't work in the European context. So they had their revolution, they overthrew power, they implemented a kind of a socialist mentality, which French Revolution was essentially socialist, right? And they got no results, right? They got a horrible outcome. They basically made space for a tyrant named Napoleon to come to power, right? And they needed it. By the way, they needed a strong leader to come in and impose order back on that society, which had broken down. There's a risk liberty can break down, folks, which is already happening. We're already descending into chaos because of this constant critique of liberty and our value system and our nation and our government, right? And you think, people on the left, they all think it's all correct. And on the right, here's the sad thing. So many of you on the right have bought into the same criticisms that the left has been making for decades about our society and country, and you don't know it. What's even saddest is many of you have been bought into an intergenerational hatred now, way to channel those resentments you have at boomers and whatnot. Like, I'm barely a boomer. I'm 62. I always felt more like a Gen X person. Not that it matters to me, but people ask me who I always called myself Gen X, and I realized I was 2 years into boomer. Like in my 50s, I finally figured that out because I really didn't care that much. But I don't feel more like those people. I feel more like the Gen X people who sort of look at the 60s generation and were like, and the people came up like, what the fuck were you thinking, And it's funny, when I talk to people who are my peers, allegedly, most of them know nothing about Marxism and communism the way I do. And listen to what I just explained to you. It's not really that complicated, right? I mean, did it take that long to explain? Think about how hard the educational system and our news media and all our political experts labor to not have an honest conversation with you about this. Most of the people on the right that are in elected office couldn't explain what I've just explained to you clearly. Even freaking Ted Cruz couldn't explain it. Yeah, people who claim to be so strong for liberty. I bet you Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, who I love, by the way, but I bet you they couldn't give you this clear an explanation of what socialism is, what Marxism is, how it works, and what the problems are. Right? So you are being fed nonsense nonstop and propaganda nonstop about this, because what they can't have you do is look at the abject failure of their top-down governance. The only thing that worked in the United States historically was the bottom-up liberty and people self-organizing, creating an amazing society. Everything that we have is amazing comes from the bottom up, not the top down in our country. Okay, I think that's enough for today. I hope that was helpful. It's Glenn with War for the West out. And go out there and start talking to people about socialism and what it is and what it isn't and why it's a problem.